The county was forgotten by maps and memory alike. It sat on the edge of nowhere, a stretch of land where the roads simply gave up. By dusk, the gray-blue fog had already arrived, rolling in from the lowlands like a rising tide. It did not just drift, it settled, thick and heavy, pressing against the trees and the rusted iron fences. The air tasted of damp earth and something sharper.
Like the static before a storm, there was no wind to move the mist.
No birds broke the silence with calls. The fog clung to everything, turning the horizon into a blurred, featureless wall that swallowed the remaining light. It felt as if the world beyond this perimeter had ceased to exist.
The stillness here was absolute.
A heavy pressure that made every heartbeat sound like a drum in the quiet. The dampness seeped into the gravel, into the wood, and into the very grain of the air. It was a suffocating isolation, a place held in a state of suspended breath, waiting for something to shatter the silence. The fog continued to thicken,
pulsing slowly, as if the land itself were exhaling a final, cold secret into the dark.
A young man stood alone at the edge of the road, his breath plumed in the cooling air, a brief,
ghost-like mist that vanished before he could catch it. Above him, a single street lamp hummed with an erratic,
electric buzz. It flickered in uneven intervals, casting long, rhythmic shadows that stretched across the pavement and retreated, as if the light were struggling to hold the dark at bay. He did not move. He kept his hands deep in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the dense wall of gray ahead. Every few seconds, he shifted his weight, the sound of his boots scraping against the gravel sharp and intrusive in the heavy silence. He watched the shadows dance, a jagged, shifting pattern that seemed to pulse in sync with the failing bulb. He was a small, singular point of life in an environment that felt entirely devoid of it. He looked left, then right, scanning the empty expanse. Nothing moved. The only constant was the hum of the lamp and the slow, steady rhythm of his own breathing. He remained anchored there, a solitary figure consumed by the encroaching gloom, waiting for something that had yet to announce its arrival. The stillness snapped. It started not as a sound, but as a tremor beneath his boots. The gravel rattled,
a rhythmic chattering that traveled up through his legs. He stepped back from the curb,
his eyes widening. A low, guttural rumble began to vibrate the very air, growing steadily in intensity until it drowned out the hum of the street lamp. From the heart of the thick, gray-blue fog, two weak, yellow needles of light pierced the gloom. They cut through the mist, illuminating swirling particles of dust and moisture that danced in the sudden glare. The roar intensified, metallic and labored, as a massive shape pushed forward through the wall of white. It was an old, rusted bus, its frame groaning under the strain of its own movement. The paint was dull, flaked away in jagged strips to reveal the iron beneath. It slowed, the engine coughing out a plume of thick, oily exhaust that mingled with the fog. The headlights swept across the man, blinding and harsh, before the vehicle finally lurched to a halt. It sat there, idling with a rhythmic, heavy thud that rattled the nearby trees. The road was no longer empty. The arrival had finally breached the silence. The bus idled with a rhythmic, heavy thud that rattled the pavement beneath his feet. He watched the front end, his hands clenching at his sides. With a sharp, sudden hiss of released air, the doors folded inward. The metal groaned, a high-pitched, strained screech that echoed against the surrounding mist. He did not hesitate. He moved forward, his boots hitting the bottom step with a hollow, metallic ring. As he climbed, he reached out to steady himself, his fingers brushing the cold,
slick surface of the door frame. The air inside hit him instantly. It was not just stagnant, it was heavy, pressing against his lungs with a sudden, localized weight that felt denser than the fog outside.
He crossed the threshold, his head ducking beneath the low frame. Behind him, the doors shivered, then slammed shut with a final, jarring impact that sealed the silence of the night away. He stood for a moment in the entryway, his boots planted firmly on the floorboards, feeling the vibration of the engine pulse through the soles of his feet. The transition was complete. The street lamp was gone, replaced by a dim, filtered glow that bled from the front of the cabin, pulling him deeper into the vehicle's interior. He stepped fully into the aisle, the sudden change in light forcing him to squint. The interior was not dark, yet it was not bright. A dim, amber glow saturated every corner, casting long, sickly reflections off the windows and the metal poles. It was a stagnant light, trapped within the glass,
vibrating with the low hum of the engine. He looked down the length of the bus. Every seat was occupied.
The cabin was packed, yet the silence was absolute. No one shifted. No one whispered. The air here was thick, smelling of old upholstery and something sharper, like ozone trapped in a sealed room. He took a cautious step forward, his shoulder brushing against the edge of a seat. The space felt impossibly narrow, the ceiling pressing down as if the vehicle were shrinking around him. He gripped a vertical pole, the metal cold and slick under his palm. His gaze swept over the rows of heads, all facing forward, all motionless. A wave of suffocating nostalgia washed over him.
A sense of having been here before, in a different time, in a different life.
He stood anchored in the aisle, the amber light clinging to his skin, waiting for a movement that did not come. He started to move down the aisle, his eyes darting from one row to the next. The passengers were a tapestry of stiff, synthetic fabrics. Every person wore garments that looked pressed and hardened, the sharp collars and heavy folds of their material unyielding to the motion of the bus. He studied the texture of a nearby sleeve, seeing the coarse, artificial weave of polyester that looked as if it had been ironed into place decades ago. Not a single thread was out of line. He leaned slightly to see past a woman sitting by the window, but she did not even flicker. Her back was held at an exact, rigid angle against the seat, her neck locked in a vertical line that seemed to defy the natural slump of a resting human. They were statues of fabric and bone. He walked further back, his own movements feeling clumsy and loud against their absolute stillness. He brushed past a man in a wide, stiff-lapelled jacket, waiting for a twitch or a shift in weight, but the passenger remained frozen. They had not moved. They had not breathed. They occupied their seats as if they had been placed there 40 years prior and had never found a reason to get up since. He halted in the center of the aisle, gripped by a sudden urge to break the stillness.
He stood directly beside an elderly man, waiting for the slightest flicker of recognition or the simple instinctual reaction of a nearby presence.
It never came. The passenger stared straight ahead at the empty air before him. His eyes were wide, fixed on a point far beyond the windshield, unblinking and devoid of life. The man shifted his weight, his shoe scuffing loudly against the rubber floor, but the sound died instantly, swallowed by the cabin. It was not merely quiet, it was a vacuum. The collective silence of the passengers vibrated in the air, a low-frequency hum that pressed against his eardrums. He looked from one face to the next, searching for a trace of awareness. Every head was angled at the exact same degree.
Every pair of eyes remained locked on nothingness. The dread was no longer a vague feeling. It was a physical weight.
Cold and heavy, settling into the marrow of his bones. He realized then that they were not waiting for a destination. They were waiting for an end that had already arrived. The intensity of their vacant focus began to distort his own perception, making the reality of the bus feel thin, brittle, and terrifyingly hollow. He turned his back on the silent rows and pushed toward the rear of the vehicle.
His footsteps sounded like hammer blows against the rubber floor, echoing through the empty space between the seats.
Every stride felt like a transgression against the stillness.
He could feel the weight of dozens of unseen eyes tracking his movement, though he knew if he turned, he would see only the same fixed,
empty stares. The air in the back of the bus felt thinner, colder, and smelled faintly of ozone and dust.
He reached the final row, where the seats were worn down to the metal frame.
He gripped the back of the seat in front of him, his knuckles turning white, and lowered himself into the corner.
As his weight settled onto the cushion, a spring groaned beneath him, a harsh,
metallic sound that seemed to shatter the quiet. He pulled his knees toward his chest and pressed his back against the vibrating wall of the bus.
He was now part of the arrangement.
He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, afraid of what he might see if he looked up at the rows of motionless figures ahead.
The bus shuddered, the engine pulsed, and he felt the crushing reality of his isolation.
The silence in the back row was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of the bus engine beneath his feet.
He could not stay hidden in the shadows of the final row forever. A desperate, crawling curiosity pushed him to look forward. He leaned out slightly, his neck straining as he tilted his head toward the front of the bus.
High above the dashboard, the rectangular strip of the rearview mirror caught the dim,
amber light. He adjusted his angle, squinting to cut through the haze of the cabin. At first,
he saw only the reflection of the empty aisle, but then the image sharpened. He saw the driver. The man at the wheel did not move, not even to adjust his grip on the heavy, worn steering wheel. As the bus jolted over a bump,
the mirror vibrated, and the driver's face shifted into full view. Their eyes locked instantly. The driver's eyes were wide,
glassy, and devoid of any human moisture. They were fixed, unblinking, and held a depth that felt like staring into a frozen well. There was no recognition, no annoyance, and no humanity.
The intensity of that gaze traveled down the aisle, piercing through the dim light, and settled like a shard of ice in the man's chest. He tried to look away, but his muscles refused to obey. He was held fast by a stare that had no end. The connection to the driver snapped when the bus lurched, throwing the man back against his seat. He gasped,
his hands trembling as he reached out to steady himself against the window frame. He needed the comfort of the familiar. He needed to see the streetlights of his own neighborhood, the cracked pavement, or the neon signs of the local shops. He leaned his forehead against the cold, vibrating glass and squinted into the night. Outside, the familiar town was gone. There were no streetlights, no houses, and no paved roads. The landscape outside the glass was a smear of bruised, shifting grays. The buildings he knew had simply dissolved, replaced by towering, featureless shapes that seemed to bleed into the surrounding fog. He pressed his palm flat against the pane,
hoping to feel the resistance of solid matter, but the window felt thin, almost like a membrane between two different realities.
The ground beneath the wheels was no longer asphalt. It was a rhythmic,
pulsing darkness that defied logic. He scrambled to his feet, swaying as the bus hit a sudden, violent bump, and gripped the window ledge with white-knuckled intensity. The world he recognized had been erased.
He was moving through a space that had never been on any map, and the horizon was nothing more than a wall of hungry, encroaching mist.
The man remained pressed against the window, his breath fogging the glass. He traced the condensation with a finger,
frantic to find a landmark. Through the shifting murk, a flicker of rusted metal emerged. It was a street sign, bent at an impossible angle, protruding from the gloom. He strained to focus. The name, etched in peeling paint, belonged to a district demolished 30 years ago. He blinked, certain his mind was failing, but another sign rushed past. Then a third. These were streets that had been leveled to make way for the highway he used to drive every morning. The architecture of his memories was being dismantled in real time.
He moved to the next window, then the next, scrambling across the aisle as the bus picked up speed.
The signs blurred, a rapid-fire sequence of ghost markers from a dead city. He saw the name of his childhood school, followed by the intersection where he had crashed his first car. The bus was not merely driving, it was traversing the wreckage of the past. He gripped the seat back, his knuckles turning pale, as the reality of his situation solidified. He was no longer on a public transit route. He was being carried through a graveyard of locations, moving deeper into a geography that had been erased from the map long before he was born. The man pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. He needed a signal.
He needed a timestamp. He needed a connection to the world that made sense. He tapped the home button,
but the display did not respond with the usual soft glow. Instead, the screen pulsed with a jagged,
violent light. It flickered like a candle in a gale, casting erratic shadows across his palms. He shook the device,
pressing his thumb firmly against the glass, but the signal bars remained empty. The screen went dark, then flared to life again with a stuttering, static-filled image. He stared at the date displayed in the corner.
His heart stalled. The numbers were wrong. They were not just wrong. They were impossible.
The display read exactly 40 years in the past. He tapped the surface again,
desperate to clear the error, but the digits remained stubborn and frozen. The phone vibrated once, a long, hollow hum that traveled up his arm and settled in his teeth, before the screen went completely black.
The digital link to his present was severed. He held the cold, lifeless slab of plastic in his hand,
looking at the silent passengers around him, and understood that the time he knew had been left behind.
The weight of the silence pressed against his eardrums. He stared at the blank screen, his thumb still resting on the glass.
Waiting for a flicker that would not come. A cold, sharp sensation bloomed in his chest, spreading outward until his fingertips went numb. He tried to draw a full breath, but the air inside the bus felt thick, recycled, and stale. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, irregular rhythm that clashed with the steady, drone-like hum of the engine beneath the floorboards. He pushed his palms against his thighs to steady his shaking. Every tremor of the bus felt like a physical blow. He looked down at the floor, watching the vibrations ripple through his boots. There was no escape. The realization settled deep in his marrow, heavy and immovable. He attempted to stand, but his knees buckled, and he collapsed back onto the seat. The bus did not slow. It did not swerve. It continued its relentless journey through the dark, indifferent to his rising pulse. He gripped the seat edge, his knuckles turning white, and forced himself to look at the rows of motionless figures ahead. They were the only constant in a world that had fractured. He was trapped, and with every rotation of the wheels, the distance between himself and his own time grew infinite.
He needed a voice, any sound that was not the drone of the engine or his own ragged breathing.
He gripped the edge of the seat, his knuckles straining, and shifted his weight toward the passenger beside him. The air felt colder here, smelling of dust and ozone. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp and intrusive in the heavy silence.
He opened his mouth to speak, but the words withered before they could form.
He watched the figure next to him, waiting for a twitch, a blink, or a slight shift in posture that would signal life. Nothing. The passenger remained as still as a statue, eyes fixed on the empty space ahead. The man reached out, his hand trembling, intending to tap the passenger on the shoulder. He hesitated, his fingers inches from the fabric of the seat. Then, a sound broke the stillness, a dry, rhythmic clicking.
It originated from the passenger's neck. Slowly, with the precision of clockwork, the head began to rotate. It did not move with the fluidity of a living person. It turned in jagged, mechanical increments.
The vertebrae grinding against one another. The man pulled his hand back, his breath catching in his throat.
He watched, unable to look away, as the passenger continued that slow, impossible arc toward him.
The head stopped its jagged rotation, locking into position. The man stared into the space where eyes, nose,
and lips should have been. There was nothing. Just a smooth, unbroken expanse of pale skin that seemed to swallow the dim amber light of the bus.
He recoiled, pressing his spine hard against the window,
his chest heaving with sharp, shallow gulps of air. The skin looked like wax, stretched taut over bone, devoid of pores or warmth.
He tried to pull a sound from his throat, but his vocal cords remained locked,
paralyzed by the sheer absence of humanity. The figure did not blink, for there were no eyelids. It did not breathe,
for there were no nostrils. It simply existed, a blank, terrifying monument to some impossible void.
The man swiped his hand across his own face, a frantic, reflexive gesture, as if to confirm his own features still remained. He scrambled to push himself further into the corner of the seat, his boots scraping loudly against the floor.
The passenger remained motionless, yet the man felt the weight of that featureless expanse bearing down on him.
Every instinct screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to obey. He was pinned,
forced to witness the terrifying emptiness just inches from his own skin, trapped in the suffocating silence of the bus. The bus surged forward, but the world outside the glass had lost all coherence. Trees flickered like static, and road signs for long-demolished streets blurred into streaks of gray. The man clutched the back of the seat in front of him, his knuckles white, as the vehicle began to vibrate with an intense, rhythmic thrum. Suddenly, the floor beneath him tilted. The engine roared, a deep, mechanical protest that climbed into a shrill whine. The bus shuddered, its frame groaning under immense pressure, as if it were carving a path through solid iron. Then, the sound of the brakes erupted. It was a jagged, piercing shriek that tore through the cabin, deafening and raw. The man was thrown forward, his weight slamming against the seat in front. Metal screeched against metal, a violent, grinding protest that vibrated through his very teeth. The bus bucked, tires fighting for grip on nothingness. The landscape outside dissolved, the gray-blue fog replaced by a sudden, blinding wall of featureless white. The momentum vanished in an instant. With one final, bone-jarring jolt, the bus lurched to a dead stop. The screech of the brakes faded into a heavy, suffocating stillness, leaving the man swaying in the sudden, absolute silence of the void. The violent shuddering died away, replaced by the mechanical rattle of an engine gasping for its final breath. It wheezed, a hollow, metallic sound that echoed through the empty cabin. Then, the rhythmic thrum that had defined the journey ceased entirely. The vibration in the floorboards vanished, leaving the man's feet planted on cold, dead metal. A ringing silence rushed in to fill the space, so absolute it felt like a pressure against his eardrums. He sat motionless, listening for any sign of the world outside, but there was only the sound of his own shallow, rapid breathing. The amber lights overhead flickered once, then dimmed further, casting long, sickly shadows across the rows of silent, staring passengers. He reached out to touch the window, but the surface was neither cold nor warm. It felt like touching nothing at all. He pressed his ear to the glass and heard only the faint, high-pitched hum of his own pulse. The bus was a tomb suspended in an endless, white emptiness. He checked his reflection in the dark glass of the window, but his own face seemed to blur and recede into the gray. The realization settled into his bones. There was no road, no destination, and no way back. The engine would never turn over again. The stillness remained unbroken until a sharp, rhythmic clicking sound echoed from the front of the bus. The driver turned his head, the motion stiff and mechanical, like a gear forced to rotate against rust. He did not look at the man. He looked through him. His lips parted, revealing a set of teeth that seemed carved from dull, gray stone. "Last stop," he rasped. The voice was thin, dry, and devoid of any human resonance. It scraped against the silence like sandpaper on bone. Before the final syllable had fully faded, a heavy pneumatic hiss filled the cabin. The front doors shuddered and swung outward, groaning as they forced themselves into the surrounding white space. There was no street outside, no sidewalk, no pavement. Beyond the threshold lay only a swirling, hungry expanse of featureless mist that seemed to pulse with a low, rhythmic vibration. It bled into the cabin, cold and thick, smelling of ozone and ancient dust. The man gripped the armrest until his fingers ached, staring into that infinite, shifting wall of white. The driver sat motionless, hands remaining locked on the steering wheel, waiting. The mist curled around the open doorway, reaching inward like fingers. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing against the man's chest as he realized the road had ended, but the journey had only just begun.
He did not move. He could not. The swirling mist at the threshold curled around the steps.
Yet it did not enter the cabin. It lingered, waiting. He looked at the passenger in the row ahead. The stillness of the figures surrounding him was absolute. They were not merely quiet, they were frozen in a state of suspended animation, untouched by the decay of the years he had seen on the display.
He looked down at his own hands, then back to the driver, whose glassy eyes remained fixed on the nothingness outside.
The logic of his surroundings finally collapsed. This was not a route on any map. He felt a sickening shift in his inner ear, a sensation of falling while sitting perfectly still. The bus was not traversing a landscape. It was cutting through layers of history that had been torn apart. Every flicker of the amber light, every metallic groan of the chassis was a heartbeat of a decade long since erased. He realized then that the bus was a needle, and the void was the thread, stitching together fragments of broken time. There was no arrival point because the destination had been destroyed before he was even born.
He was trapped in the seams of the clock, and the ticking had stopped forever. The silence became a physical weight, pressing against his eardrums until they throbbed.
He waited for a sound, a signal, or a change in the air, but the void offered nothing. Outside the open doors, the mist churned with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. It was not merely weather. It was a hungry, patient entity that had waited for decades to claim this space. He looked toward the driver.
But the man remained a statue of glass and iron. Suddenly, the engine floorboards beneath his feet vibrated, a deep, bone-rattling hum that signaled the machine was drawing power from the nothingness itself.
The mist surged forward, pressing against the threshold like a tide hitting a seawall. There would be no exit. There was no arrival. The bus lurched, not forward, but into a deeper layer of the gray.
He felt the familiar, sickening pull of the timeline snapping back into place. The doors hissed shut,
cutting off the view of the void, but the fog remained, pressed against the glass, waiting. The journey had no beginning, and certainly no end. The bus moved onward, a ghost ship sailing through a sea of erased memories, forever searching for a destination that had long ago ceased to exist.